Hello, my name is Connor Quinlan. In this review, I'm going to talk about night, in other words, nightscape photography. Now, the reason I have this fire going is not just to light up the scene for the video, but it also serves another purpose, which I'll be talking about later. Now, I'm going to do this video rather quickly so that when the fire dies, it won't be too dark. As you can see right now, I'm trying to take a picture here of the saguaro behind me. And what I'm going to do in this review is describe how I do that. So I got my camera set up over here. Now I'm not going to show you exactly what I do on the camera, but I'm going to tell you what I do. First, you want to set your mode to manual. And once you have it in manual mode, you'll notice that you can adjust your shutter speed all the way down to 30 seconds. Well, if you go beyond 30 seconds, you can actually hit a setting called bulb mode. And what bulb mode allows you to do is take a picture essentially as long as you want. When you hold down the shutter, it takes a picture, and as long as you're holding down the shutter, it'll constantly keep taking that picture. Once you take it off, it stops. Now the problem with this is that you don't want to hold down the shutter here for a whole 20 minutes. Not only is that tiring, but it'll probably shake the camera. So how do you hold it down for a total of 20 minutes? Well, the easiest way to do that is to buy a remote control for the camera. Now you can get remote controls pretty cheap, 30 bucks or so on eBay for some pretty good ones. And then what those allow you to do is push the button down once and it opens the shutter for as long as you want. And when you're done, press the button again and it closes. That's the easiest way to do it. For those of you who don't have a remote, you can actually use a special technique that I use. That's what I'm doing right now. You take a rubber band, put an eraser below it, and put it over the shutter button here. That way when you push it down, the rubber band holds the eraser on the shutter and you don't have to hold it down. When you're done, all you have to do is lift up the eraser and you're good to go. Now right now I'm taking a 20-minute exposure of this cactus here. And by taking a 20-minute exposure, I'm taking it straight up too, so that during that 20 minutes, as the Earth moves, the stars are going to streak in the sky. And that always creates a really, really neat effect. And the longer the exposure, the better the stars are going to streak. Now you want to be careful. You don't want to do an exposure for too long, or else you could get a lot of noise. Even at low ISOs like ISO 100, which I'm using at right now, the sensor will heat up. And even at those low ISOs, if you expose for too long, you'll get a lot of noise in your image. Now I live in Arizona, so it's particularly hot out here, even during the winter. So I can't go do exposures longer than 30 minutes, or I will get too much noise in the image. However, if you live somewhere where it's colder in the winter, you can actually perform longer exposures because the cool air actually cools down the sensor as you're taking the image. So, say you're somewhere up in the north where it's really cold out. You could actually take hour or several hour-long exposures without getting too much noise in the image. So remember, you want it as cool as possible outside if you're going to take these really long exposed images. And in places like Arizona, like I said, it's pretty difficult to take longer than about 30 minutes before you get too much noise in the image. Now you're probably wondering, why do I have a fire going here? It's not just to light me up, it's also for the image itself. Some of you might know about what's called light painting, and what that is say you take this cactus here, you paint it with a flashlight, and you're able to light it up. Well, that's pretty tedious work, and a lot of the times the results come out pretty crummy. One spot's too bright or one spot's too dark, or whatever that is. So instead, what I like to do is build a little fire like this, which casts light all the way up the saguaro and lights it up really nicely. It makes the light very smooth, and it makes the light really warm, which is how I like my images, a little bit warmer, whereas a flashlight makes cooler light, which isn't necessarily as good, especially for things like landscape photography. Another tool that's essential, of course, for taking nightscapes is a tripod, which I have here. If you don't have a tripod and you're trying to take pictures at night, it's just not going to happen because you need exposures that are at least over a minute long. And of course, if you want the stars to streak in the sky, you're going to have an exposure of at least 15 minutes. And therefore, you're definitely going to want a tripod. Now, I do live in a city out here, so once I get a long enough exposure, I start to see a red light in the sky. And what that red light is caused by is actually the city lights reflecting off the atmosphere. So if you do an exposure that's too long, you could get a pure red sky instead of a nice dark sky with stars in there. So sometimes what you want to do is get away from the city where it's a lot darker, and that way you don't have the lights reflecting in the atmosphere, and you can get those better streaks and expose for longer. Another thing that I would like to talk about when taking these images is how do you focus on the object? Usually it's pretty pitch black at night. You can't use autofocus, obviously. You're going to have to use manual focus on your camera. So how do you do that when it's pitch black? The answer is pretty simple. You just use a flashlight to light up your subject. For instance, here I got a swirled cactus. I use a flashlight to light it up really quickly, or in this case, a fire. And what that allows me to do is it allows me to see the cactus through the viewfinder, and I'm able to manually focus it so it's on that picture. Another thing is aperture, which is also very important. For night exposures, you want the aperture to be pretty small, around f-stop 8 to f-stop 11, or even greater if you want a longer exposure. That way, your exposure can be longer, and everything will be in sharp focus. In this case, the cactus and the sky as well. If you use too large an aperture, the cactus will be in focus, but the stars will be blurry. Now, that's pretty much all you need to know for nightscape and bulb photography. The rest of it is just practice. It takes a while to get used to taking pictures at night. Sometimes it's hard to guess the exposure, and it's hard to really focus on things that you can't really see. And it can take a couple of shots to do it. I know for me it usually takes about 3 or 4 times to get the picture that I really want, which means that you have to stay out for about an hour, 30 minutes to 2 hours. So be prepared to stay out for a while to get the right shot and to get the shot that you want. And it will take time to get used to it. It took me quite a while when I started taking night pictures, but as you do it more and more, you get better and better at it. One more key thing that I'm actually going to talk about, a nice tip for getting the correct exposure, is to use higher ISOs to calculate the exposure that you're going to need. For example, in this picture here, I might use ISO 3200 at maybe 30 per seconds to see if that will, or 30 seconds to see if that'll be the correct exposure. If I take an image for 30 seconds at 3200 ISOs and I get a picture that's pretty bright and about the brightness that I want, then I can adjust the shutter speed according to ISO 100 using ISO 3200. Now ISO 3200 is 32 times faster than ISO 100, so what we do is we take 30 seconds, which is what it took on ISO 3200, and multiply it by 32 to get the exposure that we're going to use at ISO 100. And that'll give you a pretty good approximation of how long the shutter speed needs to be. Now in my experience, I've found that the shutter speed usually needs to be a little longer than what you calculate from that. So say you calculate that you need an exposure of 15 minutes, I would go for more 18 minutes to get an exposure that's similar. And this has been a tutorial on how to take bold images at night.